This is HistoryNet's fourth live stream. With me is my co-host, Mr. Brass, and our guest, Lauren from Republican Atheists. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on the show.
Welcome.
No problem. So you got, I actually was the one that alerted him. I actually been wanting to do some sort of interview with you for a while.
Yeah, I see you've been interacting on Republican Atheist Twitter account more than most of our followers, so thank you for that.
No problem. I actually just ran into it because I was looking up stats on atheist, and I actually ran into the Republican Atheist site.
Yeah, I've been working a lot on kind of chipping away through social media and with our website to try to get some recognition on Google, try to move up in the ranks there. So it's good to hear that people are learning about us.
That's cool. Tell us all about yourself and what you do.
Well, I am born and raised in Southern California, lived in California all my life, and now I've been living in Sweden for 3 years. I relocated to Sweden to live with my Swedish partner, so a lot of people are interested to hear that because I was able to launch Republican Atheist while I was living in Sweden, which is pretty interesting. And I lived in Sweden another time in my life. I lived in Sweden right after I graduated from high school when I was 18 years old. I was an international foreign exchange student in Sweden. And I relocated back to the United States after living in Sweden. I was there for 10 years. I thought I would never return back to Sweden. My first experience in Sweden was interesting, but I definitely returned back to the United States with an appreciation for the U.S. But as time went on, I ended up meeting a Swedish man, got along with him really well, and decided to relocate back to Sweden. And professionally, I work as an online marketing consultant part-time. I do work through the computer, through the internet. And then I'm also working as a part-time teacher, actually a substitute teacher at a local elementary school in the rural village I'm living in Sweden. I'm living in a mining village in the far north of Sweden. So the population here is really small, and I'm working at a school that has about 18 students right now.
How did you come to reconcile your atheism with the political right leanings of the Republican Party, which obviously includes a lot of religious leanings?
Well, I've always been kind of conservative leaning in my views ever since I was young. And when I was young, I was Christian. I was raised in sometimes I call it a secular Christian household. I lived in a moderate Christian household where I was taught that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and I went to church every so often with my family. But at the same time, we were a fairly secular family. I was able to watch MTV and listen to the latest music, and so I never really had this vendetta against religion or against Christianity. And I became atheist when I was 18, and that was through my own thoughts. I never knew about other atheist speakers. I didn't know who Richard Dawkins was. I didn't know about atheist organizations. And so with the Republican Party, I decided that what really started to impact my views and become interested in politics was primarily three things. I kind of come down to three things. I was impacted by the Affordable Care Act that was installed by Obama. My insurance. I'm sorry, I have to stop. I'm getting a lot of feedback from somebody.
Oh, my bad. My roommate's doing a blender right now. Okay. Why do you think so many atheists are driven to the political left?
I think it's interesting because I think a lot of atheists who start to latch onto atheist organizations, they have it seems like the atheist thing to do in the United States, in my opinion, is to kind of counteract anything that's Christian. And so it's just kind of status quo in atheist groups, and I've noticed this on atheist Facebook groups. It's status quo to challenge certain topics that have become associated with Christianity, topics like abortion and basically general conservative topics. I mean, I've come across many atheists that associate the Second Amendment, being pro-Second Amendment, with Christianity, who associate being pro-life with Christianity. They associate freedom of choice with Christianity. And so I find that many atheists, they want to counteract Christianity. They want to, and it's solely Christianity. And so anything that the Christians seem to support, or most Christians, it's like, I find many atheists in the United States want to counteract that. And I have to emphasize atheists in the United States, because you have to understand that there's atheists all over the world. And atheists in Europe are different compared to atheists in India, compared to atheists in the Middle East. So I find the American atheists to be particularly interesting when it comes to political leanings.
I have Brian G in the comments says that many atheists who are left-leaning are humanists and care about their fellow human beings.
Yeah, that is something that's been happening in the atheist community. And like I said, when I first became atheist when I was 18, I didn't know who any atheist speakers. I didn't know about organizations like American Atheists or Secular Student Alliance or anything like that. And so I gradually have been analyzing these groups as I think it was at the beginning of the campaigning period for the 2016 presidential election, I started analyzing these groups and analyzing what they're promoting. And it is really interesting if you look into Secular Student Alliance and American Atheists, on their, you'll find somewhere on their website, it'll say that they actually promote humanism. And I think this is so misleading to people, because humanism is an ideology, but they don't really go out and say that to people openly. They don't say we're a humanist organization. They say we're an atheist organization. And so there is this kind of conflict in the atheist community where atheists are actually having to go out and say, I'm not a humanist, because now it seems so closely aligned, atheism and humanism. It's a bit frustrating at times.
It certainly seems that way.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that is sort of a thing. My personal thing is, I think it comes from more of the fact, like, the left-leaning atheist comes more from, like, usually they think of religion as such this binding ideology, and they just latch onto liberalism thinking that, oh, it's not that, even though if you actually look at the liberal politics, they're anything but that.
It has been really difficult. When I first launched Republican Atheists, I had this first assumption that atheist organizations would take interest in Republican atheists and maybe at least say, oh, wow, finally there's some effort in the Republican Party to let people know that there's a secular crowd within the Republican Party. But I've found instead that many atheist organizations have completely ignored me as the president reaching out to them, or many of them have challenged me.
Yeah. As an atheist Republican, what do you think is the best role for the Christian faith should play in society? Cultural, social?
For me personally, I do view it more as a cultural importance. And this is something that's kind of new for me. Our board member, Dr. Robert Price, maybe you've heard of him. He's actually...
Yeah, we've heard of him.
Yeah, he has an interesting take on it. He's much more well-read on the topic of Christianity and the history behind it. But personally, I do view Christianity as having importance, a cultural importance in society. And I've been talking with more people about this and more atheists. And it's really interesting because I find a lot of many atheists don't want to talk to me, or they get a bit frustrated with me when I talk about the significance of Christianity. And this is something I've been analyzing myself. So it's kind of difficult for me to say right now. But I'll just say that when I became atheist when I was 18, I didn't hate Christianity. And I have an appreciation for my Christian upbringing, which a lot of people find that interesting coming from an atheist.
Brian G wants me to ask you what humanism means.
It's really hard to explain humanism because if you look into American Humanist Association, for example, and you go to their website, there's a section that says, "What is humanism?" And I read into it, and there's just different quotes of what humanism is. And I just say it's an ideology. And if you look into it, it has a really interesting history. There's 3 manifestos that have been published by humanists. There's a humanist manifesto, the first humanist manifesto, the second humanist manifesto, and now there's the most recent third humanist manifesto. So if you want to look into what humanism is, I encourage you to look into the humanist manifestos, because they kind of read out what humanism is. I kind of consider it to be comparable kind of to like a 10 Commandments, or because there's kind of like bullet points of what you should think as a humanist.
Yeah, and what's actually funny is I remember the first manifesto was actually formed by a more religious-leaning humanist side. It wasn't until later on where they sort of just split off from the religious humanism and became more focused on atheist, and now there's more secular humanism.
Yeah, if you read into the Humanist Manifesto, the first one, you will read, and it's interesting, it said that the point of humanism this was like the early 1900s, the point of it was to mimic religion. So I find that to be really interesting about humanism, and to compare it to humanism today.
Yeah, I think it is always a very interesting thing when it comes to that. One question I got is that, wait, you got any questions, Blanco?
Yeah, that was leading me into my next question, which is, as an atheist Republican, what do you think about church-state separation in our contemporary society?
I think it's definitely an issue to pursue, and but I personally don't take much interest in separation of church and state issues, at least not on the level that groups like Freedom from Religion Foundation or American Atheists take interest in.
Mm-hmm.
There are some issues that I take interest in, such as religion being taught in public schools, and issues like that. But I haven't made it such an issue or such a cornerstone with Republican Atheists, because I think there's so many other atheist organizations that are addressing separation of church and state. And sometimes I'll even challenge them on some cases, because sometimes I feel that it's actually infringing on religious freedom. Some of the atheist organizations, the mainstream ones that we often hear about. So it is an interesting topic for me, separation of church and state, because for me it's a balancing act of, okay, that is infringing on separation or church and state getting involved together, but at the same time there's issues that are infringing on freedom of religion.
Yeah, like people think of Ronald Reagan, for instance, as a Republican Party hero, but he was also essentially the leader of the Reagan Revolution in the 80s, which had a huge religious, specifically evangelical, born-again Christianity component to it. What are your thoughts on him?
I find him to be a really a great president to look up to. And I actually went to the Ronald Reagan Library in Southern California last year, which was really interesting to see, and I really recommend going to that location. But I find many great things about Ronald Reagan. I really like that he challenged communism, which is another topic I've become interested in over the last few years. And so there were many positive things about Ronald Reagan, and I don't think he's discussed enough within the atheist community. Actually, there's a lot of topics that aren't discussed enough in the atheist community, I think.
What did you like about his policies the most?
The main one, I like that he recognized the threat of communism, and that was something I really respect about him. I also liked his more traditionalist values. I thought he was, well, this isn't much with his policies, but he was a really great speaker. I thought he was a great motivator for the country.
Interesting. All right, Brass, ask your questions.
All right. Well, first question is, since we always hear about it from atheist organizations here, how is it like there in Sweden? Is it the secular socialist paradise that people like atheists over here keep saying about?
Sweden, to me, well, I would say there's a lot of issues that Sweden is facing. And Sweden is a very dynamic country. Things are changing. And so when people, I find it's not just simply atheists, but it's Americans in general, especially young people, tend to think, well, first of all, they think it's a socialist country. It's not. Sweden is actually the most capitalist country in Scandinavia. And Stockholm is a business hub. But it's a mixed economy in Sweden. There is a free market system in Sweden, while at the same time there is the state-run systems. But Sweden is facing a lot of challenges because of the recent mass migration, which has received a lot of coverage. It's been devastating for Europe, I would say. And many of Sweden's social programs are facing challenges, from the education system to the healthcare system to how they're taxing their citizens. It's been really fascinating to see, and I would say it's not the paradise that people think it is. I mean, you're taxed incredibly, and then the services are performing more poorly over time, from healthcare to education. It's kind of like your payment into the system. You continue to pay into a system when you're getting less in return.
Well, yeah, that figures because, if you think about it, really, if you're putting money into, if the government is running it, really, then the people that are doing it know that they're going to be paid regardless of how well they do, so there's not as much incentive.
No, it's really interesting in Sweden. I'm fascinated how difficult it is to even schedule an appointment with a doctor here. And I live in the far north of Sweden. I live in a part of Sweden that's actually the least populated part of Sweden. I live in the Arctic Circle. It's a place where most people do not want to live. In fact, most Swedes have not been up here. But I thought, at least being in a least populated place, I would think that there's a more smooth program up here, not so many people relying on the local hospitals. But it can be difficult just to get a nurse on the phone, to get someone competent on the phone. There's been times where I've actually just decided to drive directly to the hospital to talk to a doctor because people on the phone tend to not be very competent.
We have similar issues over here.
They'll tell me different things, and it's very challenging to get things done here in Sweden, despite it being such a modern country.
We have similar issues over here.
Yeah.
I know you answered this a little bit. But I'll figure I'll go more directly into it. Given how in America, at the very least in America, the majority of atheists tend to be liberal Democrats, have you experienced a bit of a pushback from fellow non-believers, especially with your critiques of some of their political groups?
Yeah, I have had a lot of pushback. In fact, it's really surprising to me because this is part of the reason that led me to launch Republican Atheists. I didn't launch Republican Atheists because I wanted to go to Republican meetings and crash their party and say, hey, stop prayer in your meeting. I actually was motivated to launch Republican Atheists because I was in atheist Facebook groups, which is how a lot of young people communicate these days. We're in Facebook groups. And I noticed that even when I was in a local atheist Facebook group based in California, not too far from where I was living when I was in California, was during the campaigning period for the 2016 presidential election, everyone's talking about politics in atheist groups. I mean, politics is a big thing for atheists, in the groups at least, when you're in these groups. And I just found a lot of pushback when I shared my more conservative-leaning opinions on issues. And it wasn't just simply pushback. I mean, people would kind of interrogate me. Someone called me poison in the group. Some of the members in the atheist groups would tag the administrator of the group and say, this person's causing a problem. She's a troll. And and I would end up getting kicked out. And I was always polite in these groups. I don't call people names or anything like that. I'm just very direct on how I think. And so that's kind of partly what led me to launch Republican Atheists, because I found that there was nowhere I could really share my views. And I wanted to make a group that would prove there are atheist Republicans.
Yeah. The next question I have is, in America, the Republican Party seems to be known as the theocratic right-wing party. Like they call it the Christian right here. Have you experienced like where they talk about that a lot? And what's your experience with it? And have you heard much about it?
Oh yeah, I hear it a lot from atheists in the United States, and all the many atheists that I'm connected with, about the Republican Party being the Christian right. And I understand where they're coming from. There are a lot of religious tones in the Republican Party, but I think people aren't really looking at the broader picture of what a political party is. I mean, the Republican Party is one of the two main parties in the United States. And so you can't just look at it as the high up people. You know, you have to look at it as who's at the state level, who's at the city level, and then who's just the Republican next door, living next door to you. I mean, how do they think? And I think it's really interesting if you look at just the spectrum of the Republican Party, especially if you start looking at groups that have been propping up on college campuses. That, I mean, there's young Republican groups, there's college Republican groups, and then there's just some conservative leaning groups that have Republicans in them, which is like Turning Point USA. And a lot of these young people, on college campuses, they're not, you know, religion isn't the forefront for many of them. So that's kind of what I think of with the Republican Party, is I look at what's the dynamics, what's happening at the younger level, younger people.
I think some of it, at the very least, like with the Christian right and stuff, I think it comes from a sort of biased perspective because, like I said, most atheists in America, at least, tend to be more liberal leaning. So, like, I always find it funny because if a Christian in America, like a Christian politician in America, says they want like maybe some more of Medicare for all, they justify that with their religious beliefs. Many atheists don't even care about it. They'll just say, oh, well, you know, that's something we want anyway, so, you know, they're fine with that. But if a politician happens to use their Christianity for something they don't want, that's when they get the Christian right stuff comes in there.
Yeah, so, you do see this kind of conflict, because when I first started analyzing the U.S. atheist community, I thought, oh, they just don't like religion, they're going to challenge religion. But yeah, you find this kind of camaraderie between Christians who are left-leaning with atheist organizations. Like I saw an event somewhere in New York where it was this kind of left-leaning activist event, and there was an atheist group that participated in the event, but it was this event also had partners with religious groups, with some churches, and I thought it was really interesting that churches and this atheist group was working together with a more left-leaning agenda. But at the same time, you know, from my perspective, I have also found some similarities with Christians, and some of the best interviews I've had so far representing Republican atheists has been with Christians. So even I find a level of similarity with right-leaning Christians or religious people.
That's fair. Oh yeah. Well, you know, since he's all over the media and pretty much everyone knows about and has their own opinion of him, what's your opinion on Donald Trump's presidency? Any political agreements and disagreements you would like to share?
Well, I voted for Donald Trump, and one of the main reasons why was because, well, I just don't like Hillary Clinton. I you know, it came down to Hillary Clinton and Trump, and even before that, when it was between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, I was just like, no, these, you know, they don't encompass anything that is really of value to me. And Trump, I thought he was really outspoken, and I'm not a fan of how simple he is at times and kind of poor with his word choice. But at the end of the day, based on my observations of what's happening in Europe, based on my observations of Obama with the Affordable Care Act, and some other issues, I said, Trump, voting Republican is the way to go in that election. So,
he's quite the character, I'll give you that.
Yeah, I think I can't say that I support everything about him, but generally speaking, I think he's done a pretty great job since he's been in office, and I think he's brought a lot of morale to the country. And it's really interesting to meet people in Europe who are pro-Trump too, which I have come across people sometimes.
Yeah, I actually always do find it funny because whenever you compare like Donald Trump's border ideas, like how he wants to stop immigration, well, illegal immigration, that is, and if you actually look at his plans, they're not that much different than what Obama proposed. It's like Obama proposes it, the Democrats automatically love it, but if Trump proposes basically the same thing plus a wall, oh, we can't have that. So I always found that funny. It's like they're basically just anti anything Trump says.
That's how it seems, and it's really interesting because coming from my perspective in analyzing Europe, I mean, Europe also has been having its issues with security. Sweden became a closed border country a couple years ago. For a decade, Sweden was an open border country, but now it's a closed border country. They are checking people who are entering the country, and it's actually very difficult to become a citizen of Sweden. It's expensive to relocate to Sweden. The only way I could even get my foot in the door with Sweden was because of my Swedish partner. But if you just want to, move to a country like Sweden, it's not easy. And I find it really interesting that I think what Americans that I speak to, they tend to not be aware that, every country has its protocol to enter the country, to live in the country for an extended period of time, to work in the country. If you want to come to Sweden, you either have to have a job lined up or you have to have a Swedish partner invite you to the country. Otherwise, you have to shell out money, a lot of money, to show that you can afford to live in Sweden. So I don't understand why people in the U.S. or many Americans seem to just not understand the concept of entering a country and being in a country for an extended time.
And another, I would like to also say another thing. In America, in atheist groups over here, many of them, are very pro-science, and they tend to charge the Republican Party with not being pro-science. Have you, how would you say you blend science with your political, your republicanism? And do you see that, there are pro-science Republicans, and you've noticed some not on the Democratic side?
Well, there is an organization called Republican where instead of AN at the end, it's EN, and that group is more, it's kind of a faction of the Republican Party that's more interested in climate change and issues like that. But I think what's kind of interesting when people associate, when I find many atheists in the U.S. talk about science, they assume science is strictly about climate change. And the recent topic has also been transgender, and that's a scientific topic to many atheists now, which I find to be a little strange, because to me, there's much more science. I mean, economics to me is also a science. It's studying economics. It's studying the impact that economics has had on people. But, I find many atheists don't want to discuss economics or look at that as a scientific topic. Studying society is also a scientific topic. And one of the basic things I find that what I would like to see more atheists talk about is just the basic thing of the scientific method. But I think if more atheists observed something as simple as the scientific method, that would be very helpful instead of getting involved in these very advanced topics.
Yeah, many of them just pay lip service to science because they want to feel better than religious people, and are usually paranoid that religious people in the U.S. are advocating for anti-science laws, whatever that means.
It is a bit strange, but I mean I remember there was that March for Science that happened in the U.S. not too long ago, and I found that to not really be about science. If you guys remember that March for Science.
I
Oh
remember
yeah,
something like it. Like
Yeah, and
the
I saw a lot of atheist groups were promoting that, but I wasn't on board with it because it's like what is science? And I just couldn't get on board. It seemed like it had more of a left leaning agenda, kind of like things like Women's March or something like that. So
Well, yeah, I mean that's always the sort of thing I've always noticed with a lot of atheist groups is they say they represent atheists, but they happen to just mean atheists that agree with us, like on everything, politics and whatever. So they tend to
that is
push
kind
out
of
their
how it
ideas.
is because I've launched Republican Atheist. I launched Republican Atheist 2 years ago. Right now we have 20 correspondents representing 18 states, which is, in my opinion, a really great accomplishment for a group representing atheist Republicans. And right now we also have over 1,200 likes on Facebook. And so, personally speaking, I would have thought by now the atheist organizations would have taken interest and said, wow, it's really interesting. You guys have actual representation. But I find that Republican Atheist doesn't fit their protocol of the more left-leaning politics. So Republican Atheist has actually been ignored. And no one has really reached out to me in the atheist community to interview me.
Before we get to before we address the questions in the audience, I have one last one.
Uh-huh.
What are your views on feminism?
Oh, I think I kind of view feminism as, I've heard people call it like waves of feminism.
Right,
And
there's first wave, second wave, third wave, and fourth wave now.
yeah, and so I think the current wave of feminism is, I don't really call it feminism, I call it matriarchy. I think it's become very, the modern feminist has become very demanding, and I see it the worst here in Sweden. Sweden is one of the most feminist countries in the world.
Tell us more about that.
Well, there's actually a feminist party in Sweden, and I forget how long ago they launched, but it was a while ago, maybe a decade ago or something like that. And they're actually a recognized political party, and but they never really went anywhere. And their support is so small right now that they're not anywhere in the running for. They have no significance. But there is a feminist party in Sweden, and it's more than I was reading that more than 2/3 or approximately 2/3 of government positions are women. It's interesting in Sweden where I think women, for example, in commercials are presented as strong people, whereas the men in commercials in Sweden are usually tend to be soft-spoken, quiet, and there's a lot of issues going on in Sweden right now I find really interesting with population decline and relationships. The relationship model in Sweden, the traditional relationship model it exists to a degree, but it's, I would say, kind of non-existent to me. It's kind of expected in Sweden that people are going to part ways, so Swedes don't really get married. There's a documentary that's really interesting on YouTube. I can share it with you later, but it talks about how men and women in Sweden have been having increasing problems with finding relationships with each other. And there's been increasing numbers of women who have been having self-insemination births. So Sweden, according to this documentary, Sweden has the largest sperm bank in the world, just so you know. And so there's been increasing numbers of Swedish women just bypassing the whole relationship with a man, just ordering the sperm delivered right to their front door, impregnating themselves, and having a family that way as basically a single mother. And meanwhile, the Swedish men, there's some conflict there. It's not very unusual to find Swedish men who have Thai wives in Sweden, especially where I'm living up in the far north. So this is really fascinating, in my opinion, the Swedish society.
It definitely is interesting. We don't really hear about it a lot. I mean, we hear about how great Sweden is, sure, but we don't really get to hear about the culture in it. I believe the church I believe Sweden correct me if I'm wrong, Sweden used to have a state church, but I believe like 10 to 15 years ago they got rid of it for some reason. And
Well,
now it's
the
not
Church of Sweden and the Swedish government used to be combined. They used to work together, but I think it was around year 2000 they separated. So now they operate separately, but Swedish citizens still have the option to allocate some of their income as tax to the Church of Sweden. But it is separate from the government. It's just that they have the option to say they can say we want a part of our income to go to the Church of Sweden. But the Church of Sweden has had a decline in Sweden, and there were recently some churches that were sold in southern Sweden just because it's becoming more difficult for the Church of Sweden to manage its locations, because it has locations throughout the entire country. I mean, even in my small village where I'm living, which has about maybe 500 people, there's a church here, and there, even in these small villages throughout Sweden, there's churches. So you have to think of how much economic stress that is on the church to manage these sites.
As someone who lives there, has the decline in church going been better or worse outcome?
I haven't lived in Sweden long enough. Personally speaking, I think one of the most horrific things to happen in Sweden was the recent mass migration. And I don't think people understand how horrific that was. I know people, I say horrific and people think, oh, it means full out war. But in my opinion, when I rethink of Sweden with mass migration, just letting thousands of refugees into the country, some people will just call them immigrants, and not asking any questions, not asking who are these people entering our country, and many Swedes who raised their hand and said, hey, we kind of want to know a little bit about who these people are. They were automatically shunned. They were called Nazis, similar to what we hear in the United States. It's really interesting how there's these parallels between the United States and in Europe, between people calling other people Nazis and racists and so forth. But sometimes I question if the lack of at least acknowledging the Christian history, if that plays a role in something like people not questioning mass migration that happened. Because right now there's a lot of conflict in Sweden involving cultural differences relating to Islam. And it's not just an issue in Sweden, it's an issue in Denmark, it's an issue in Germany, it's an issue in France, and it's really fascinating.
I know because, I know at least in all European countries, they tend to be more homogenous, so they have their culture really nailed down. So introducing Islam into it, is sort of like breaking up the usual homogeny of things.
I think people just, and it's similar in the United States. We weren't taught about Islam. We weren't taught about conflict in the Middle East. It's just recently in my personal life that I started learning about. I mean, I always knew there was conflict in the Middle East, but it wasn't something that I really focused on or studied, and I never knew much about Islam. It's just until recently, because of mass migration, that I started learning more about customs in the Middle East, what's considered normal over there. And so, yeah, it is really interesting now to analyze their cultures and customs coming to a country like Sweden, which in my opinion, Swedish people are so innocent. They can be very naive. Sweden has no crime. Now it's having an increase in crime. But yeah, I think when I think of Swedes, I think of just people who don't know crime. They don't know the concept of someone that could possibly be out to hurt them. So they were kind of naive when it came to mass migration. And for me personally, from an American perspective, I think it was really a horrific event to happen. And so its impact is going to be long lasting here.
Many atheists over here think that the lack of crime over there is due to atheism. Is there any merit to that?
I don't think it has to do with atheism. I think it has to do with, as you pointed out, it's a homogenous country. It's a country where really people don't really want to move to Sweden, honestly. And I'll tell you, I actually was hesitant to move to Sweden with my partner. because I had the experience of living in Sweden, and I said, oh, based on my first time experience, I didn't want to move back here. Sweden is so far north, and it's cut off from Central Europe. So unless you live in the southern part, close to Stockholm or Malmö, you're kind of, you're kind of stuck in Sweden. And Sweden is also kind of a cold country. It's one of the most antisocial countries as well. It's actually comparable to Japan. I was watching a documentary about cultural comparisons, and Japan was noted to be actually the most antisocial country in the world in one study. But Sweden wasn't really too far off. I mean, Swedes, they are antisocial people, and a lot of Americans they don't understand this. They haven't looked into the culture of Sweden. So as you pointed out, it is homogenous. It's predominantly white. The people are kind of at the same level, and I think that has to do with its socialist leaning system, where everyone kind of has similar education, everyone has similar values. The influence of religion has been similar. Sweden hasn't gotten a lot of immigration in the past. It's not built on immigration like the United States. It's only had waves of immigration. It had a wave of immigration in the 90s, and then it had another wave that I don't think was such a big impact, but then it had this most recent wave. And I think it's been noted in every wave that crime has increased in Sweden, conflict has increased. So I don't think it has anything to do with atheism in Sweden. It just has to do with its history of being a homogenous culture.
Well, I mean, I always find it funny when they do bring up the crime in Sweden, because if you actually do look through the laws in many places in Europe and you look for their historic leanings, you seem to realize that most of the laws are some form of updated version of the Inquisition laws, which in and themselves is an update of Roman law. So you really just see, like, it has a lot of religious leanings to it, and that's built into the system. So I always found it funny because they're basically saying, well, I mean, if you simply have a law book that has Christian principles in it, at least, then you can have a low crime society, which, like, okay, many Christians would agree with you. But, like, I always just found that funny. Going into the history, I bring up the Inquisition more because I'm actually doing a series on it.
No, I haven't studied it.
Do you want to get into the comments, Blanco?
Yep. Okay, Brian G has a lot of questions here. One's not actually a question, but he says, oh, you'll take interest in the church-state separation when children are forced to read and memorize the Bible, pray, and learn young earth creationism.
We'll see where it goes. There's a lot of organizations that are challenging it, and I kind of feel like it's covered.
I mean, if you actually look at it, the number of, like, even in the United States, really, where we get branded as, like, half the people are, like, there's a misconception where they say that, like, 41% of people in America are young earth creationists. No. That's actually, when you actually go specifically down the line what people actually mean when they're saying these things, you only find, like, maybe 19% of people actually are very, like, dedicated to young earth creationism. So even in America, it's very much a minority. And
I actually consider, I mean, compared to Sweden, and I mentioned Sweden a lot. I really like to compare the U.S. to other countries because it puts into perspective, how bad it is in the U.S. But I consider the U.S. to be a very secular country. And yes, there is a huge Christian population there, and I think that's going to continue because I consider the U.S. to be basically the last safe haven for Christians in the world. I mean, we hear about persecution of Christians in the Middle East. There's persecutions of religious people in communist countries in China, and recently the United Kingdom turned away an asylum seeker who was Christian because she was causing conflict with the Muslim population in the United Kingdom. I mean, it's fascinating to think that the UK even turned away a Christian asylum seeker. So really, the US, in my opinion, is the last, it's kind of sad to say, really kind of one of the last safe havens for Christians in the world. And so that's something I see happening in the United States. But at the same time, I do see the U.S. as a very secular country. In Sweden, my Swedish partner, I'll just let you know, me and my Swedish partner, we're going to have a family. We're starting a family right now. And so my Swedish partner asked me, so are we going to baptize the child? So I'm going to have a child soon. And I thought that was so interesting because, for me coming from the U.S., I actually never have been invited to a baptism. I was born and raised in California. Baptisms weren't I've never heard of a baptism. Even in my own family, who is predominantly Christian, I never heard of baptism. But in Sweden, a more secular country, baptism is normal, baptism of children. My partner said all the children in his family here in Sweden have been baptized. It's tradition. It's tradition for the royalty in Sweden to baptize their children. In fact, it's not a small event when the royal family in Sweden baptize their children. It's a huge event. It's a media covers it. They dress the baby up in a gown, and you would think that would not be a big deal in a secular country like Sweden. But traditions in Sweden are acknowledged. I work at an elementary school, like I mentioned, in the rural parts of Sweden, where the graduation last year for an elementary school, it took place in the local church. And it just had me think how atheists in the United States would be so mad that the graduation is at the local church. How dare this happen?
It's similar to Japan, where not one building is erected without being blessed by a Shinto priest.
Yeah, it's so fascinating if you start to look at religion around the world, even in countries where we say Sweden, it doesn't value religion, but it values tradition, and tradition in Sweden involves religion.
Okay, next comment. Ask her if she would be concerned if fundamentalist Muslims were actively taking a foothold in our public schools and government.
I do take concern about that, and it's not just because of fear mongering. I have studied Birmingham, United Kingdom. If any of you have heard about Birmingham, very interesting topic. You can look it up. It's called Operation Trojan Horse, and this is an event in Birmingham, UK, where Muslim groups started moving into Birmingham. Gradually, their population began to grow, and it was found that they began to vote out school officials, like principals of the schools and school board officials, and started to vote Muslims into the schools. And the schools had to be analyzed, like seriously analyzed, and they found that the schools were teaching pro-Islam curriculum, they were teaching anti-Western sentiment. And so I think of Birmingham a lot when I see I would say Muslims running for office, and I don't go to the point of saying that obviously they shouldn't run, but you have to be cautious of them. Just like atheist groups in the U.S. are they're like a hawkeye on Christians all the time. It's similar for Muslims, and so I keep that in mind.
I will take questions from John Buck now. We'll get back to Brian later. As conservatism places such a high priority on the family, do you have any insights into doing what's best for the children when you have parents that don't share religious attitudes?
Yeah, I think ultimately parents who don't share religious attitudes. So is that kind of like a Christian with an atheist, or?
This one was from a Christian.
What was that?
This question was from a Christian.
I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, I think the priority should always be on children. That's important.
And another one from him. Ask her if Swedes are becoming more receptive to traditional or conservative ideas now from seeing some of the ramifications to too liberal an attitude towards immigration.
I think Swedes are, but you're not going to hear about it because still conservatives are still not such a loud voice in Sweden, and kind of suppressed. But in Sweden, there's a right-leaning party called the Swedish Democrats, and this party historically has had very little support. But gradually, over the last, according to my Swedish partner, the Swedish Democrats, it's a right-leaning party, has gotten more and more support. And in the recent election in Sweden, which was, I forget exactly when it was, I think it was last year, they had the most support they've ever received before. And the Swedish Democrats has so much support now in Sweden that they actually have challenged the Swedish government to be just completely left-leaning. So the parties had to, well, I don't want to get too much into it, but I'll just say, yeah, the Swedes are becoming more conservative-leaning, I would say. And it's causing some mayhem for the government in Sweden, which has been really interesting to observe.
And back to Brian. Ask her how she accounts for the numerous young earth creationist evangelical Christians that have been recently elected in Congress.
Evangelical Christians, that are the younger ones. I think there's what I think is happening really is there's some hiccups happening. The atheists have been making some statements, and there's been reports coming out that the non-religious community is now comparable, if not larger, than the Christian and Catholic community in the United States. So I think there's just a lot of fear happening. And as you pointed out, the many atheists are left-leaning, are liberal-leaning, and it's really frustrating for me as an atheist to have to come out and say, no, not everyone, not all atheists voted for Obama, not all atheists wanted Hillary Clinton to win. So I think there's this polarization where atheists and the non-religious are more left-leaning. The Republicans are kind of feeling like the Christians have to latch onto the Republican Party. But I kind of view it overall as, I call it a hiccup, because we do see that some extremist religious people are losing influence. And so, I'm really proud now to have a group of Republican atheists even exist. And I think that says something to have this organization exist right now.
I think what really should be focused on always be the policies, really. That should always be what comes first with it, and not even particularly the religious beliefs. I remember they used to always say that, they want more atheist representation in there. And, we got like two, I believe, I can't remember at the state level. I don't forget, but I know they have two atheists in pretty prominent government places. So they are gaining some representation, despite, their very small population here.
Well, there was recently two atheist Republicans who were voted in at the state level in New Hampshire. They're no longer in their office. Unfortunately, they're no longer in public office. But that was just within the past couple of years that atheist Republicans won their campaigns or won the election for public office. I know of an atheist Republican who's on her city council in Arizona right now, and I've been kind of chipping away to try to find people throughout the U.S. who are atheists and who are Republican, and they're kind of hard to find, but I've been gradually finding them. But yeah, they do exist. I actually am right now in contact with two Republican county groups in California who are interested in having me speak at one of their upcoming events. So I hope something comes from that. But I'm fascinated and glad that Republican county groups even take interest in communicating with me.
I always found it funny because I remember for many years now, I think ever since Bush, W. Bush, where atheists were saying, we just want a non-religious president. Can we get a non-religious president? Well, we got Donald Trump, and he's the most non-religious president we've had, and now they just hate him. So
I think so. There's been a lot of footage that there was one clip of him I saw where he was at a church gathering and people were really into the service, hands raised and stuff. And Donald Trump was just standing there kind of looking really awkward, like he's looking from side to side, like. And so I would say he's kind of I don't see that much of a traditionalist in him compared to George Bush or past Republican presidents.
I mean, I think even Hillary and Obama were probably more traditional than he is when it comes to it. And I remember one time they asked him to do a Bible verse, and they gave him a Bible, and he actually held the Bible upside down. Was trying to read it, so it was just pretty funny because it's like this is definitely out of his comfort zone.
Many atheists are also freaking out because many fundagelicals apparently they claim that he's God's champion or whatever. I can assure you, Trump is not a godly man by any stretch of the imagination.
I think I agree with that. I think, and I find it really interesting actually that evangelicals are latching on to him so much because it's been brought up sometimes that the things that he's doing are sometimes it kind of conflicts with Christian views and things like that. And it's so I find it really interesting and but I didn't really care. I voted for him and now Republican Atheists has a lot of supporters for him. So
like I never met any Christians that like him for that reason. I know a lot of people like him because he's blunt. He tells it like it is, or he doesn't cater to political correctness.
Yeah, I think a lot of people like that as well. He's just really direct and he draws attention to issues. I mean, I was surprised that when he brought up issues in Sweden, and the media pointed out, I don't know if you guys remember that, he brought up something he saw on Fox News about Sweden. And I was impressed that he even mentioned Sweden because Europe, I think, has been just not covered very much at all by American media.
Well, typically it's only really covered when Democrats want to say, well, we should seek to be like Europe, and how much of a paradise they are. That's really when it comes up, really.
Our friend Merchant Struggle can tell you how fucked Europe is at this point.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. It's not discussed much, and you really have to go to alternative media sources and cross-check with what larger media sources have published to see if things fall in line, and so it's something that's not discussed very much. So I was impressed that he brought that up, and I thought I was impressed by that. So yeah.
You got any more questions, Brass?
No, I actually did like this. This was actually pretty good. I know I haven't ever seen Lauren on any like YouTube videos on here. Do you have a YouTube channel?
Republican Atheists does have a YouTube channel. I don't put up a lot of videos, but I have put up videos of certain places I've been to, and so I'm always looking for locations to visit to kind of represent Republican Atheists. But yeah, we're on YouTube, we're on Facebook and Instagram, and I'm always hoping to get more coverage and to do interviews and so forth. So thank you for inviting me on the show.
No problem.
Really
it was very nice to be able to talk to you and get a different view on things.
Yeah, I think I would say right now Republican Atheists is probably one of the most unique atheist organizations. It's nothing like any other atheist organization. We're not a humanist group. We're not out to attack the Republican Party. We're not out to attack Christians or anything like that. Republican Atheists generally talks about policy, and we don't focus so much on the atheist aspect. We focus on policy and just to come together as atheists and know that we're not valuing the Bible above everything. And so that's kind of something nice to have in common with the group. And we've had Christians take interest in Republican Atheists. As I mentioned before, some of the best interviews I've had were with Christian podcasters one of which was on live radio in Indiana with an outspoken Christian podcaster. That was a fun interview.
I'm guessing our friend Brian is a liberal, given all the comments. It doesn't sound like she understands what young earth creationism is.
Trust me, I understand what young earth creationism is, and people need to really stop obsessing over it, because I know even young earth creationists who don't really care that much about this issue.
I don't see it as a huge issue. And as I said, reports have come out saying that now the non-religious community in the United States is bigger than the Christian and Catholic communities. I mean, you can go follow American Atheists and follow Secular Student Alliance. They've been blasting these reports all over the place that the non-religious community is growing in the United States. And so I don't really take much concern about young religious people. I don't think they're, and based on my personal experience of growing up in a Christian household, you know, I in a way kind of feel, in a sense, I was an atheist in a way. When I became atheist, not much changed in my life, and I was friends with a lot of moderate Christians in high school as well, who had an easygoing life with their family, who did really well in school. So I think there is this kind of overreaction to the religious right, and there's a lot of issues happening in the world that need, in my opinion, more attention.
Fair enough. You know, I always do find funny is like there's a lot of secular issues that I feel that, you know, the atheist groups in here are attaching like religion to, so they have something to fight against. Like abortion, for example, they always want to make that a religious issue, even though it's a secular issue. There's atheists on both sides of the spectrum on it. So, and it's not even by its very position, it's not a religious position.
And there's even an actual atheist organization that's pro-life. I can't remember their name off. It might be Secular Pro-Life or something like that. If you look them up, but they have an actual logo. They have a Facebook page. They have a pretty decent following. And there's many atheists that come to Republican Atheists that are pro-life. And so it is really unfortunate to see many mainstream atheist organizations ignoring these atheists and ignoring these opinions. There's such a polarization happening in the atheist community that it's just been so fascinating for me to study. And there's atheist or conservative atheist Facebook groups that have been propping up on Facebook. There's a blog that has existed since 2008 called The Atheist Conservative, which I really suggest looking into. Who it's managed by a woman named Jillian Becker, who, in my opinion, hands down, is the most impressive atheist I've ever come across. And she just has an amazing history. But you're not going to hear about these atheists. Another atheist conservative is Heather McDonald. She's a published author. She's been featured in City Journal. She speaks on college campuses across the United States. Yet you go to the average atheist organization in the U.S. and you're not going to hear about Heather McDonald. You're not going to hear about Jillian Becker. You're not going to hear about Ayn Rand, who was an atheist. So it is really a polarization happening that has led something like my organization, Republican Atheists, to be established.
All right, one last question for you before we end this. What do you make of the new atheist / anti-theist movement? Speak as an atheist.
I think generally with the new atheist movement, in some ways I give it credit. Atheists have been able to become more outspoken, and I can now say, go out and say I'm an atheist, and really I don't fear for much of a backlash. But granted, I did grow up in Southern California, which is a more liberal part of the country compared to the South. So I do come across atheists that are living in the South who are still kind of in the closet where they're living. But I think when you look at parts of the U.S., the atheists have been more outspoken. But at the same time, I do think that the new atheist movement has caused a problem, I would say, for for atheism altogether. Atheism is a very simple thing. It's lack of belief in a higher spirit. That's all it really is. There's nothing else that defines an atheist. An atheist can be a Democrat, an atheist can be a Republican, an atheist can care solely about Second Amendment. You know, I think with the new atheist movement, it's kind of put all this baggage on what an atheist is. It's like, oh, an atheist has, as you pointed out, an atheist has to be pro-choice, an atheist has to be all about climate change. And so this has really polarized atheism in the United States. And in some ways, I feel the atheist community in the US is a joke, because now it's like an atheist is assumed to be a Democrat, an atheist is assumed to be at the next Women's March. And I think it's really done a disfavor to just what an atheist in general.
Okay, any Brass, any last words?
No, I actually think, that was a pretty good conversation. Yeah, it was nice having you on, Lauren.
Oh, thanks for having me on the show.
But just so our friend in the live chat is concerned, he says he's been in these groups and you don't like many questions, apparently. That he wouldn't last long in your echo chamber, whatever that means.
Well, I think Republican Atheists is really impressive. As I said, we have 20 correspondents now representing 18 states. We're about to get one in California, I have a feeling. I might be speaking in California to Republican groups. I think Republican Atheists has a lot of potential, and it's going to be a really fun project. So we have a website, republicanatheist.com. We're on Facebook, and we are on Twitter. And we're always open for conversation. We have a Facebook group also for people to join and have conversations with.
Are you hear that, Brian? Okay, this has been HistoryNet's 4th podcast so far. Co-host Mr. Brass and our guest Lauren from Republican Atheists. You can reach her on your website, republicanatheist.com, and for her personal site, laurentalk.com. See you next time.